So this is the zipper bag application that you will complete after you have done your centered zipper sample. You will cut 4 pieces from your sample fabric. You can choose to swap sample fabric with someone else to have a contrast. You do have a couple options with your fabric choice. The bag is designed to have a contrast band and a front pocket and a top pocket. On this sample, the back and the front are the same piece as well as the small pocket, and there is only one contrast. You also have a choice to do a contrast band and a contrast back. In that case, there's 2 different colors that will correspond with the small pocket and the large pocket on top. For today's sample, we are going to be doing something like this with a contrast band and a contrast back, so you can see as we're working with these 2 pieces of fabric which will be the front and which will be the back. If you're doing the contrast, you will have 3 large pieces. 2 of them will end up being the front and the back. One of them will end up being that strip I will refer to as the contrast strip, and one of them will end up being the small pocket. If you choose to have the back the same as the front, it would be a large piece that would match, and you would only have 1 piece that is a different color. Or if you choose to do all the same, you can. Right now, I have already serged the long edge on each of my 4 pieces. You will be inserting 2 centered zippers, similar to how you did it in the sample, but with one difference. So let's move these aside. Before I sew these 2 together, I want to mark where my zipper is going to go. So everyone will have 2 9-inch zippers. I'm using a contrast color so you can see where my stitches will be. With these zippers on the sample, you lined up the zipper with the edge as you normally would with a centered zipper. So with the peaks and the valleys, you lined up the valleys with the top and marked where the bottom would be. You would regulation stitch up to the bottom, do a back stitch, and then baste up to the top to insert your zipper. However, because we are doing a zipper bag, this needs to be centered on their piece of fabric, not lined up at the top, because we want it to be centered on the bag, so there will be one difference. So before we do that, we want to make sure that we mark where these are. With my seam gauge and with my pins, I'm going to mark how much excess I have between the edge of the fabric and the edge of my zipper tape. So if I eyeball it right now, I see I have about 1/4 of an inch. If I don't move that and I come over here and measure, I have about 3/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to slide it and kind of find the difference between the 2. So now I have a little more than 1/8, or excuse me, 1/4 of an inch, and a little more than 1/4 of an inch. What I want to do is mark the end, so I know that I'm going to do a regulation stitch to the end and back stitch, based along the length of the zipper, and then go back to a regulation stitch. So I'm going to take my pin and mark where the bottom of that is, right underneath. And that pin is going to mark where I will change from a regulation stitch to a basting stitch. Line that back up with my pin, and now I'm going to just move that zipper tab out of the way. I'm going to take my pin and mark where the top of that zipper is. So this is different from your sample, where you only had to do a regulation stitch at one end and baste to the end. On this sample, or excuse me, on the application, we will change from regulation to basting back to regulation. So we are going to start out on a regulation stitch. We will back stitch at the beginning, go to our first mark where we put our pin in, back stitch again to secure that when we are inserting our zipper, and then we will adjust our stitch length to a basting stitch between a 3 and a 4. So as you can see, my stitch length will go up. I'll stitch to my second pin that I marked, and then I will drop back down to a regulation stitch, back stitch, continue to the end, and back stitch one more time. I can adjust it by dropping it back down, or I can hit the clear and it'll reset the settings in the computer on our sewing machine, and we'll drop it back down to our regulation stitch. So we'll make sure we're adjusting our stitch length. So what I've done is I have pinned together my two pieces that will become the front and the back along the long edge that I've serged. When I did serge these, I was careful not to trim too much off because I want an accurate width. I just transferred the pin from one layer of fabric to two, but this is still going to be where my zipper stops are. So I have one here and I have one down here. I'm going to start with the regulation stitch at 5/8, making sure to backstitch at the top. I'll go down to my first marking, backstitch again, and then change to a basting stitch. Just like your sample, you want to make sure that this is at an accurate 5/8 because your zipper tape will be inserted on that 5/8 seam allowance. When I get to my pin, I'll stop, do my back stitch for 2 or 3, and then I'll remove my pin, change my stitch length to a basting stitch, still keeping my seam allowance at 5/8, and I'll sew down to my second pin. When I get to my second pin, I'm going to change my stitch length back to a regulation stitch. I'm going to remove my pin that's marking where I need to change that stitch. Stitch a few stitches, reverse for 3, and then finish out at the very end, back stitching at the end. So here I have a back stitch from regulation, basting, another back stitch, and regulation with a back stitch at the end. Now I'm using a contrast color so that you can see the stitching. If you were doing this on something that you would be using, you would want to use matching thread. I have gone and done that with my 2 large pieces. So one will be the front and one will be the back. And then I've already done the same thing. I'll flip it on this bobbin side so you can see. Where I did the same regulation, based, regulation with back stitching at beginning and end. But this piece has my small piece, which will become my front pocket, and the contrast color, which in this case will be black. So now what we're going to do is we're going to press this, set the seams, and then we'll insert our zipper with a few differences from when you did your sample.